Welcome to Careers in the Arts. I am Brooks Tracy, and today we are lucky to have with us a local celebrity of sorts, Mr. Guy Peterson. How are you doing, Mr. Peterson?
I'm doing great. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Let's go ahead and jump into our first question. Could you please describe your job?
um, well, I'm an architect, and architecture is a profession that's, most people think you just, you hear a lot, you draw blueprints or do something like that. Architecture is a creative field. I find it, and I think it is, to be one of the arts. And essentially, we're problem solvers. We get assignments just like your students get assignments, but our assignments are challenging. I often call it like solving X, where X equals the intangibles, the things that are harder to measure. Every project, as an architect, if you're a client and you come to me, and just because it's something everybody can understand, is they say, we would like you to design us a new home, which is a real honor to me, because a home is really the form man gives to his life, I think. And if, with that comes, they bring a piece of property, a site. They bring a program, which is what we call it in architecture, which would be a list of your needs, what you want to build, how big you want to build it, what kind of rooms you want, what's important to you, relationships to the exterior. All these things, they're developed as a kind of a basis for design. And then you've got all the jurisdictional issues that you need to deal with today, which is your zoning codes and your building permits and all these other, and they're getting more and more complicated as my career over 40 years I've had, that the rules and regulations are becoming more challenging. When I get to X is what makes one architect different than another one, and that's that intangible that's harder to measure. And I think that's where you bring the emotion and the poetics of architecture to the team. So I take all these requirements, the site, what does it have to offer? What are its views? What do we need to protect you from? What is the orientation? Are the trees, topography? Is there water? All these things that we need to take advantage of. And then we have to then take their list of program requirements and create something that's meaningful and special. But at the same time, it has to follow all the current regulations. And and then one of the big parts they bring to the equation is budget. It's not just you got a blank check, go out and do what you want to do. So you have to balance and solve these problems and make all those things happen. And the architect is the leader of that team. You bring in other consultants like structural engineers and landscape architects and mechanical, electrical engineers to design all these systems. But the architect is the prime consultant, or the kind of the traffic cop that kind of organizes the team and then actually designs the structure and the building and manages the process. And so when I get hired, if I get selected to be the architect, it's usually an interview among other architects, and you present yourself and your experience, and then they interview others. And if you're fortunate to get the nod to be selected, then you got to negotiate a contract for your fees. And that is, that's something that, you have to, it takes years to get to the point where you can, be maybe more successful than you used to be when you're younger. You'll do almost anything just to get the experience. But as you get older, like I am now, you can, be a little more selective in how you do that. And then, you have to present something to them that they agree to build, and they like it. And they say, yes, this is what we want to build. But architects have to know a little bit about everything.
And that's great. And you mentioned how versatile it is and how there's so many different aspects to it.
Yeah.
I was curious, is there any one part in particular that you would identify as probably your favorite part, maybe of like a project from start to finish? This is my favorite part of the architectural process.
Yeah, for me, it's the design process. I am a design architect. I mean, I do, design has been the focus of my practice. And there's also, you know, you as an architect, you can go into different specialties. You can become a healthcare architect. You can be an aviation architect. You can be a correctional facilities. You can do all sorts of different types of fields that really you need to have specific education, school. There's firms that just do schoolwork because they understand the rules and regulations required, say in state of Florida, that you have to follow. And it's difficult as an architect to break into these fields if you've never done one. I mean, if you were interviewing me to do the new Sarasota Middle School, if there was such a thing, you would ask me, how many middle schools have you done? And I say, well, I have not done any. And you're interviewing other firms that have maybe done dozens. And they'll say, well, why should we hire you? Well, you're not going to get the experience to middle school until you do your first middle school. So it's like, it's a catch-22. You can't get the experience until you get the opportunity to do it. So you have to make yourself stand out in some way that they realize we need to take a chance with this architect because he's going to do things. Maybe somebody has done dozens of them. They do them the same way every time. And there's nothing fresh about it. It's just, they just design it a little differently. It looks a little different. Whereas somebody that hasn't done one, they're going to think, you know, maybe I heard of an architect that got a judicial center. He had not done judicial centers, well-known architect, but he was shortlisted and interviewed for this, I think it was in Miami, the new judicial center down there. And having not done one, he came in and he just said to the committee, judicial architecture is in a rut. That's what he said. And they said, really? And he said, yeah, you're going to get the same thing, just coming at you a different direction, but you need somebody that's never done one that's going to really solve this problem in a creative way. And he got the job and it became a national award-winning project. So you got to, you know, it takes experience to get new projects, but if you don't have experience, you got to figure out a way to get that experience by setting yourself apart from somebody else. And, you know, architecture, like any other business, can be, I won't say ruthless, but a lot of architects are competing for very few jobs often. And if there's a big new commission coming up, everybody wants it. My suggestion to your students in whatever profession you take, and I was the commencement speaker at the University of Florida a couple of years ago, and I shared this with the graduating class, is you never make yourself look better by making somebody else look worse. So you never go into an interview and say, well, I know you're interviewing, you know, X, Y, and Z and A, B, and C firm. And, you know, I've heard that they really, you know, messed that project up. Or you go in there and you say, I know the firms you're interviewing, every one of them are going to do a great job for you. They really are. You've got great firms. You can't go wrong. But this is why I am going to be better. Not because something bad about them, but something that's better about you. And I think that's a message that I think in any career is important. It's better to win on your own merits than something else. So
one of the things that I like to get across with these videos is not only the aspects of the job. What is the job? What does it entail? Everything that goes into it, which is extremely important for people to hear that are interested or potentially interested in a profession. But another thing I really like to get across is how you get to that point, how you get to the profession. So a question I've got for you is, could you share what your educational background is and how you came to be in the successful position that you are in?
Yeah, that's a great question because, you know, not everybody goes off to college and ends up on the career path that they probably maybe thought that they were going to do. I grew up in Sarasota. My father was, I think, the 29th doctor in Sarasota County when he moved here in the early 50s. And I was always just, I wasn't told, but it was expected that I was going to be a doctor. I have two brothers. They're both doctors. And I went off to the University of Florida. I got accepted at Florida and Emory, and both had, you know, pre-med programs. and I chose University of Florida, and I'm glad I did. And I went off to UF, and after I graduated from Riverview in '72, and enlisted in the pre-med program, just expecting I was going to be a doctor. And as I got started in the pre-med program, I mean, it was tough. Um, my first, they didn't have semesters back then, they had quarter system. But the fall quarter, my first quarter at university, I had third year physics, third year chemistry, third year calculus, starting as a freshman. And then I had American institutions and English. I mean, that was a heavy, heavy load. And then I had a roommate. I lived in the dorms, and there was only 4 rooms on a floor. You probably know Murphy dorms up there in Florida since you're from there, but there's only 4 rooms on the floor, and one of them, we all kind of were roommates because we all shared, one bathroom, and it was a great place to go to college and to live. But one of my roommates was an architecture major, and I'd be sitting there, to early hours of the morning studying physics and calculus and chemistry, um, and he was over there building these really cool little things and having fun. And I thought, he's having a lot more fun than I am. And so at the winter quarter, I stayed in pre-med, and then in the spring quarter, I took a introduction to architecture class into my freshman year. And I absolutely fell. It was Introduction to the Building Arts was the name of the class, and I loved it. I really, really fell in love with um, the idea of architecture. And so I went home at the end of my first year and told my father, I said, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm changing to architecture. And I went in architecture, eyes wide open, and I did really, really well in it. And I think also there was a subliminal kind of attraction to architecture growing up in Sarasota because of the history of modern architecture back in the 40s and 50s and early 60s when Paul Rudolph and Ralph Twitchell were doing amazing work, and Victor Lundy, and then all these young architects came to Sarasota to follow these trailblazers and be a part of this new movement. It was really kind of a movement of tropical modernism that came out of the international style, which was developed in the Bauhaus. It's a whole nother story, but it's an architecture about honesty, about transparency, about bringing the indoors, outdoors in and the indoors out, and expressing the structure, and just a very honest and proportion and rhythm and all these things. And I grew up in Sarasota. My parents were friends of Tim Siebert, Jack West, and my parents would tell me that these guys, these architects are well known. They're doing some really amazing things. So when I was in high school and senior year, there was a storm that came through Sarasota, a no-name tropical storm, and my friend of mine and I answered an advertisement in the paper. They needed some grunt laborers to come out and help clean up the debris in their yard from the storm. Some concrete block walls got knocked over, and kind of just clean up. And so we called, and they said, sure, come on over. So they hired us to do that. And I didn't know at the time, but it was the artist, Sid Solomon. It was his house, and it had been designed by Gene Leedy, who was an architect at the Sarasota School. It was out on Blind Pass Road at the very end of Siesta Key, before when Midnight Pass still existed. And it was a concrete structure, 2 pavilions connected by a concrete bridge. And I never seen anything like that in my life. And I didn't realize how powerful architecture could be. And Sid Solomon invited us in and took us into a studio which had 20-foot ceilings and these huge canvases, and his art is just absolutely phenomenal. And that resonated with me, and I kind of took that with me. And I think when I decided to pursue architecture, I always remembered where I came from. And then so now I'm kind of a third generation or late second generation Sarasota School Architect, I've tried to kind of carry that torch forward and build on that movement of architecture, because it inspired me and still inspires me today. And those principles are ones that I hold dear, and they define a lot of how I practice architecture. Anyway, that's how I got to where I am.
Yeah, it's always
Now,
fascinating here because everyone's got a completely different story about whatever their
yeah,
profession is, how they ended up getting into it. You know, whether how early on it
yeah,
was. Maybe it was something that was by mistake, but they realized there actually were roots earlier in their life that was leading them that way.
yeah,
So it's so interesting. And when I'm going to share your website here in a moment, it's kind of interesting that your whole family, your father, and your initial background was in medicine, because I know I saw some examples of medical complexes in the
yeah, yeah,
hospital that you
yeah,
were able to
yeah.
work on.
That was funny, yeah, especially when you show the critical care center right there on 41. I did uh, back in the 90s, early 90s, and my dad was still practicing. And I told him one day, I said, you know, Dad, I didn't become a doctor, but I just designed the biggest expansion of the hospital. So I got to put my fingerprints in the medical profession in my own kind of way.
Yeah, and that's a great transition point, because what I'm going to do for you right now is, because I'm going to bring up your website and talk about a few of these, how they're so significant to Sarasota. And these are even pieces that I'm sure a lot of people recognize when they're driving around, like
Yeah, perhaps. Uh-huh.
the Center for Sarasota. One in particular I want to scroll down to here that I know a lot of people are going to recognize driving down 41 that we alluded to here is this. It's kind of interesting to hear how you're coming off of just saying how you do residential now, and then to compare it to this project.
Right.
Could you speak a little bit about this and the I'm sure the complexities that went along with it?
It was it had the five most complex departments in a hospital. It was originally going to be called the critical care tower, then it became the critical care center. But if you stay on that image for a minute, it's all changed now. Hospitals are always evolving, and they don't typically go back to the original architect. They always hire new people. But the whole lower level where you see those kind of blue lights down below, that was parking, and that was the emergency care center down below. So you could actually park under the building. And on the left side, where just above where your little hand thing is, that's where the ambulances come in. So the lower level was the ECC, the emergency care center. And then the next level up with all those big windows along 41. Yeah, that's a hallway that goes into operating rooms. And that whole level is the OR. And it has that area above with the louvers. That's that's called an interstitial space. That is a whole floor above the OR that's dedicated to mechanical systems. And those three little curving areas on the left there, those little pods that stick out, those are little storage areas along another hallway that goes to the operating room. There's 20 ORs in there, and that's where they store gurneys and other things and devices and different things to supply that. And then on that same level, if you go over to the far right, heading north, there's one big window there. That is the recovery and pre-op area. So right where your hand is, that's where, when you come out of the OR, that's where you go to the recovery room. And then on the other side of that is the pre-op before you go into the OR. And then if you go above that little square windows, that little, right there, there's a thin band of windows there. That's the laboratory. That's the medical laboratory for the hospital. And so if you're doing a surgery, they'll send things up there for a frozen section to check and see if it's, if they're looking for cancer, whether it has suspicious cells. They also do all the medical tests for the hospital are done in that laboratory. And then the big pods up above with the big bay windows, there's 2 stories of intensive care units. The first level, there's 2 stories. The first level all the way across, I can't remember which one's which, but one level is cardiac intensive units, and the other level is all medical intensive care units. So if it's non-cardiac, you'd be in the medical intensive care, and if it's cardiac related, you'd be in the cardiac intensive care. And you can barely see it if you go to the far left side, above those surgical storage pods as you go down. Yeah, and then past that big tree, you'll see a little palm tree up on the roof. Yeah, right above it. That's it, right there. That is a roof terrace, and that is all palm trees, a grove of palm trees up. You really can't see it, if you're driving around. But that's where you went behind that, looking on that roof terrace was for dialysis, where you have to sit there for hours. And we wanted to be able to look out on a roofscape and have a pleasant place for the people that had to go through that experience to look out on. And then on the top of the building, at the far other side, on top of the intensive care pod, there's a hillport. And a helicopter, you may see them land there every once in a while. It's the last pod on the farthest one down, right there, right above that. There's a hillport landing pad. First hillport I've ever designed. And so anyway, it was, so when we were designing this, I had to meet with the cardiac intensive care user group, the medical intensive care user group, the ECC, emergency medical, the laboratory, the surgery, and each user group, that's part of the pre-op, I think. Each department had a group of physicians and nurses that would help us develop the program of requirements. And it was a very complicated project, but it came in under budget, and it was very successful. And I was very proud of it.
And it's just another example of some of the work around town that's like so iconic that we'll see. And there's another one that's a commercial building, but it's a much smaller scale than the hospital I wanted to point out that some people probably recognize. And it's this one. I remember when this one first went up. Yeah, the Girl Scouts of America, the Girl Scouts of Gulf Coast, Florida.
Gulf Coast, Florida.
Right off where Cattleman ends, the south end of Cattleman. So what went into getting this one? Was this another one where it was opened up for proposals? Was it something you looked into, or how did this work?
It didn't have a request for proposal. The board of directors decided they needed to build a new facility, and they had acquired this property out on Cattleman and Proctor, and they had an architect on their board of directors, and he, I think, helped them develop a list of architects in the area that he felt that should be interviewed. And I was one of those firms. And so this is another kind of funny story, not funny, but interesting story is when you go in for these interviews. So anyway, you didn't do a formal proposal. You just got a call, and then you went and met with the staff and learned about the project and what they're looking for. And then they asked you to come in and make a presentation to the board of directors. And, or actually they had their own selection committee. And then, so it was on a Saturday morning, and I think I had, when you go for a job interview in architecture, you either want to be the first firm that's interviewed. If there's, say there's 4 firms, you want to be first or last, no matter how many firms there are. Because if you're first, then the impression you make on the selection committee, every other firm that follows you is going to be judged against you because you were the first firm to go. They'll say, well, that second firm wasn't as good as the first one, or the third one wasn't as good as the first one, maybe better than the second one. So it's an advantage to go first. And then it's also an advantage to go last because you got an opportunity to make the last impression. So I think on this one, I may have gone first. I don't remember. But I do remember, I know you may know this in your art world, but there's a museum in Atlanta, Georgia called the High Museum, designed by Richard Meyer, a very famous American architect. And he went into the interview for the High Museum, which is a beautiful building in Atlanta. And he went in all by himself. Here's this multi-million-dollar museum. And he comes walking into the selection interview by himself. And his reason for doing that is he says, sometimes people come in with 15, 20 people. And the selection committee looks at this group of people and said, how are they going to manage all these people? Where Richard Meyer came in and said, you're hiring me to manage everybody. You're going to talk to me. And so I'm the one that you need to interview. And he got up. So when I went and did the Girl Scout interview, I went in all by myself, anybody with me, and I just sat there and just talked to them. I had a conversation. I talked about how this would be a beautiful place to sit and read a book, how try to talk about the poetics of how architecture can be moving for the young girls that are going to use this place and their families. And so I think it was a very personal thing for me to come in and just talk personally as if I'm your architect is what I'll do, versus coming in with a bunch of engineers and other people. And then there's thinking, now who's going to do what? Who was that other person? So I found that to be a successful strategy often. So that's kind of the story about how I got this. So I was selected number one, and then, went through a lot of programming and to try to develop what they needed. And then the design started, and they accepted that, and the rest was history. So, but I was, honored to, I've done a lot of pro bono work, and I've done a lot of work for nonprofits. Um, I've done, I can't talk about where it is, but I did the shelter for Spark Safe Place and Rape Crisis Center, the shelter for them, the Center for Architecture. One of the images on my screen that people might recognize, it's one of the smallest, probably the smallest project I ever did. It's on the website. I saw it a minute ago. Was the little memorial for William and Marie Selby at Selby Gardens, where we entombed their bodies. It's a little water feature, but it's a very sculptural little piece that I'm very proud of. So, you do all sorts of things as an architect.
I, can just imagine doing this project. You get a lifetime supply of Thin Mints, right? So it works out.
There you go. Yeah.
Is that what they say when you went
they
into
were great.
the,
They were great clients and a great group of people. And it's a pretty, it's not your normal building. And I give them credit for, looking forward and doing something that's going to, be different, but forward thinking.
Oh, it definitely stands out.
Yeah. And,
and there was another piece on here, kind of like progressing through like the large commercial to another organization, a company's location. I wanted to bring, I think it was up top here, this piece right here. This is a residential property that I know you did. And one of the things why I wanted to point this one out is because I believe this is the property where I was watching a show on Netflix once, and they did a profile of this one.
Yes. This was a project that I got. It's obviously a residence. It was probably one of the more controversial projects I've done, only because it doesn't look like the house next door. I was one of two architects they interviewed, and I got the project. But it was featured. There's a TV show that's produced by the BBC. It's called The World's Most Extraordinary Homes, and they feature architecture around the world. And I think they're into season 3 now. And I've seen the show. It's architecture with a capital A. Some of the architects that I've admired and followed throughout my career have been featured. And when they contacted me about featuring this house, I was just so flattered and honored to be part of the show. But when you design a home you don't just design a house in anywhere you don't just look at the house next to it or the house across the street and say, I got to do something that kind of resembles or respects that. What you really want to respect is a more larger urban kind of pattern that you see in neighborhoods. And that's relating to scale and materials. And so I look beyond just the houses across the street and next door, but I look at the larger, more regional, close urban area that I'm building in, and do something that's going to be respectful of that. This is not a very big house, but it's a very it's a house that has a lot of experiences that you can have, whether they're outdoor courtyards up top, the roof garden, interplay between, like, you're going up a stair there looking through a window down to the lower level. There's lots of, and this is part of, from the outside it looks like the big tower, but when you get up there's all sorts of outdoor spaces and things like that.
Are there any other buildings on here that you would specifically like to speak about, maybe about the process, or there's a unique story behind it?
Well, the little one right below the Spencer house that you're coming up to with the telephone poles.
Right here?
That one. Yeah, that's, a lot of people probably have seen that. Anybody that used to go to the little restaurant called Social down on First Street. there's a little back courtyard where you could have dinner or drinks. And you looked up, this is an alley house in downtown Sarasota. And I did the photography studio that's on Second Street. And my client I did that for decided he wanted to move downtown. And the site was on, it was a big ramp that you go up into the photography studio. You can see on that last image you just had there.
This one.
You see that ramp? Yeah, there's a big garage door. And that was a huge open photography studio. And you could drive trucks in there or cars and photograph them. Well, he had this little area to the left where the house is. It was basically the size of a two-car garage. And he said, could you build a house in a garage there? And I said, well, we can extrude, a two-car garage into something interesting. So we made this kind of townhouse home for him. The second level is bedrooms, and the third level is living, dining, and then the rooftop is got roof, and you look out over Big Pass out to the Gulf of Mexico from downtown. And let me see if there's anything else that, well, the Center for Architecture, that was, you talk about preservation, that was the Sarasota School of Architecture building designed in 1959 by Joe Farrell and Bill Rupp.
Actually, could you do something for me? Because I know you've referenced this, and I know what it is, but I'm sure a lot of people have heard of the School of Architecture in Sarasota. Yeah. Could you explain a little bit of what that was, like when it was at its prevalence, kind of what their style was, and its importance in architectural history?
Yeah, people think it's a school like it's a school like you teach at a school, educational facility. School is used as in a different term here. Back in the early days in Chicago, when they started building high rises, the first high rises in the world were developed in Chicago when they invented the steel frame. And the architecture that came out of Chicago in that early days was called the Chicago School of Architecture. It was like a school of thinking of design professionals and architects that they called it a school only because they all subscribed to the same kind of philosophy. Well, what happened in Sarasota, there was an architect, Ralph Twitchell, that was he was the local architect for Cadizan, and then he designed the Lido Casino that had been torn down. And he had a pretty good reputation here in town as a local architect. And a young architect out of Harvard came to apprentice with him in Sarasota. His name was Paul Rudolph, who became arguably one of America's greatest architects. He came as a young architect and worked for Ralph Twitchell. And then World War II happened, and he went off to the Navy, and then he went back and finished his graduate work at Harvard, came back, and they practiced for a while. And he got a famous photographer, Ezra Stoller, to come down and photograph some of his work, Paul Rudolph, and put them on the map. And another architect, Victor Lundy, unrelated to them, but at the same time, also ended up becoming one of America's most foremost architects, was practicing in Sarasota at the same time. And he did, across right near your middle school is the Lutheran churches there in Bahia Vista, the big sweeping roofs and stuff. Those are Lundy buildings, and he did a lot of great work in the area. But with Lundy and Rudolph, Rudolph later left Twitchell and just had Paul Rudolph architect. And two big projects he did was Riverview High School, and then he did Sarasota High School addition. And but he did a lot of other work in Sarasota. Joe Farrell was a Florida grad. He worked for Paul Rudolph when he was in school at the University of Florida. And Bill Rupp worked with these guys too as an apprentice. And then other architects came to town and started building in the same vein as Rudolph and Lundy were doing. And Gene Leedy, who I mentioned, designed Sid Solomon's house. He was the one that coined the phrase many years after the 60s when people had kind of left Sarasota. And he called it the Sarasota School of Architecture because it was a school of thinking. And it was a movement of architecture that was known all over the world. And there was a very, very forward-thinking school board that we had. Uh, Philip Hiss was the kind of the entrepreneur that helped hire. He hired Rudolph to do Riverview and hired Rudolph to do Sarasota High, and then all these other young architects that came to kind of follow these guys. They all got commissions to do like Sarasota Middle School. I mean Brookside, where I went, but they've torn down now, and all Alta Vista that Victor Lundy did, and all these architects did these amazing schools. You're looking at some of Lundy's, Rudolph's work right there. Um, um, I mean, that there's one of mine right up there in the middle too, the one with the yellow bar on it. That's one of my houses. But like Victor Lundy's is that one that has kind of the round window on it. The round, that one, that's a Victor Lundy. It's it was a dance studio.
Yeah, still downtown. It's right before
Yeah,
you
still
get down to the
downtown.
courthouse.
That was a Victor Lundy building. Maybe go back to those images. Maybe Galloway's is there. Victor Lundy did. That's one of my all-time favorite Sarasota buildings. A lot of Rudolph houses are in here. Tim Siebert, that more coastal house. I don't see Galloway's, but that one with all the frames on the upper top left, that's a Rudolph house. Um, and but anyway, that became a very, very important and consequential period of time for architecture, not just for our area, but for America. And this is what I grew up around. You know, these are the houses and the places I would go to and see. And it was kind of by, just osmosis that it became an inspiration for me. And you got to admit, there aren't many cities that have buildings like this back in the 40s and 50s that were being done. So that's what the Sarasota School of Architecture is.
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of my students will be either going to Riverview, which is a new structure now, but the historic building that had previously been there was his, or Sarasota High, where they've got this structure there. And also Sarasota High is really unique to see kind of the juxtaposition between what is the first historic Sarasota High, which a lot of people see on 41, which has been turned into the museum now, and then into the Rudolph structure behind it, and then just into some additions that local architects have also added on. And it kind of goes into a question I've got for you that we had touched on a little bit, where I know you have done a little bit with local architectural preservation. I know you kind of had a little bit of a hand in the campaign for keeping Sarasota High the way it is. Can you talk a little bit about like kind of what is still been preserved there, and like what is the area that you kind of had a hand in?
Well, I didn't have anything to do with Sarasota other than negotiating with the superintendent of schools at the time, that Riverview was going to ultimately be destroyed, but they would commit to saving Sarasota High School. But this building, we fought for years. It was on the world's most endangered species, most endangered building list. And we had a international design competition that we're going to turn it into the music quadrangle. And the school board just had made up their mind that there's nothing we could do that they would save Riverview. And I think one of the things that they had going against us is that they had failed to maintain Riverview High School. And you see those awnings that they put on there, they took out the concrete sunscreens and they put pitched roofs all over it. And they had destroyed the integrity of the building through deferred maintenance over years. And then the hallways would flood, and then they'd make us as preservationists trying to bring this building back to what it really was. We kind of looked like we didn't care about the students because we wanted to save a building that floods. There's Paul Rudolph right there. And which is not, we cared about the students, but we thought that the building could be preserved and repurposed. And we proved that it could be, but they just didn't want to do it. That's when they had the concrete sunscreens. Then they put awnings in there. I mean, the building had lost its integrity. And so, and then the parents say, why would anybody want to save this piece of junk, kind of a thing? Because it looked like a piece of junk at the time. And so, anyway, we may have won a bigger a battle, but we lost the overall war. But I think the world was watching, and I think even though we weren't successful, I think we did make people realize that, something about preserving buildings is a very environmentally sound thing to do, because it is the most green thing you can do, because the energy that goes into producing a building and the materials is just unbelievable. And if you can repurpose that and reuse it, then you're saving so much energy, and it just makes a lot of sense.
And before we get out of some of your examples here, I know we were talking before we sat down here that there's some projects that you've done that are very prominent projects in Sarasota that you said you currently don't have on here. Were there any that you wanted to share that some like my students would recognize from around the area?
I think one that maybe many students will recognize is out at Peterson Park, the tall finishing tower for the rowing is a project that I'm very proud of. And I've done another one that nobody can see because it's kind of hidden on 60 acres on the bay down south, but it's a preserve and Chinese kind of literary research facility for scholarly retreats. And there's a number of other residential projects that I've completed since I've last updated my website.
One of the things that I really find unique about your work is you're taking something, it's almost like there's like an inspiration, or even in your restoration projects, or there's little homages in your work to a historic style of architecture for the area. And in itself, you're then creating a whole new generation of these works of art that are paying homage to the past, but then in themselves, they are extremely unique and they're beautiful in their own right with their own unique design. So it's really one of these things that makes you such a interesting architect for our area, is that you're not only providing us with new works of art in our community, but also you're helping to continue the lineage and history that we have of architecture in our town. And it's something that I could say myself as a lifelong Sarasota resident, it's something that I'm very appreciative that you've done. I know yourself being a lifelong Sarasota resident. It's just something that I really appreciate going forward, and I hope that the next generation of architects view building in the same way in design. And so the last question that I want to give to you before I get you out of here is, what advice would you like to hand down to the next generation of architects?
Find your own voice. There's nothing that's been done that hasn't been done before. We all learn by seeing, traveling, looking at other people's work, but it's not, you don't copy that, but you find things that inspire you, and then you use that to develop your own language. And if you love what you do, I really believe that you'll be successful at it, and never ever give up. And I always say my next project should be my best project, and I think even if I'm still got a lot of years of hopefully. I'm at the age right now when Frank Lloyd Wright produced, still 90% of his work was ahead of at my age. So, it's an old man's profession. But I do think that you just give it your best, all your best, and don't settle for anything other than that. Be passionate about what you do, love what you do, and just, always give it your best effort.
Well, thank you so much. And that's sage advice from someone who does know what he's talking about. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me and share with my students today. I know that I can't wait to drive around town and start spotting some of your past and some of your future projects that you'll have popping up around town. Thank you very much. Please stay safe during these times and keep up the great work.
Well, thank you. You too. Appreciate it.